Okay.
All right.
So it is September 21st, 2023, and I'm here with Mickey Schubert, who is Frank and Schubert on StreamYard, recording his experiences about being in the Vietnam War. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you, and kind of interesting for me to be talking about this after so many years.
Yeah. It kind of brings back a lot of stuff when you start thinking about it.
Oh, it does. It does.
Um, so why don't we start? Your full name is Frank Nicola Schu-
Nicholas,
Nicholas Schubert.
right.
And when were you born?
I was born in Washington, D.C. on the 3rd of June, 1943. Parenthetically, I would note that June 3rd was the day that Billy Joe McAllister threw something off the Tallahatchie Bridge in the Bobby Gentry song. But that's another story.
And where you were born in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
What were your parents' names?
My father was Max Schubert, no middle name. My mother was Elizabeth Schubert. They came to this country in January of 1939, so they were here 4.5 years when I was born.
Mm-hmm.
Hungary. They came from Hungary, and they're Jewish.
And why did they leave Hungary at that time?
Uh, I can only tell you that generally. I am a historian. I've written about Hungary in the 20th century. My father never talked about it. And so I don't know what his perceptions were, though I know what was happening in the region where he grew up and in the country at large.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand he was. The fact is that the Hungarian quota to the United States was so oversubscribed when they tried to get out that my father was clearly a wave of people who are trying to get out of the country at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but and so whether he knew that Oscar Beregi, the leading Hungarian Shakespearean actor, had been banned from the theater or not, I don't know. Whether he was actually aware of the vandalism in the major town near where he was born took place because he didn't live there anymore, I don't know. But I know these things were happening, and I know it was time to go. So my mother, on the other hand, talked too much about it, and she always talked only in the framework of her own personal tragedy because she had to leave her furniture in,
Mm-hmm.
in Hungary. So I don't know precisely why they left. But I think it's clear, okay, by the circumstantial evidence.
Mm-hmm. And your grandfather stayed? Your other family stayed behind?
My parents were the only ones on either side of my family who got out. My grandfather and my father's three siblings on that side stayed. My mother's six siblings also stayed. Neither side fared well during the war, which is hardly surprising. My mother's family was in Budapest. My father's was in a town called Watz. My grandfather was murdered at Auschwitz around the time of my first birthday. I only knew that subsequently because Hungary and the U.S. were at war. So, we didn't know what was happening to anybody. And of course, I was too little to even care, even know about things like this. But the salient thing is that, the information trickled in after the war. And my father just never talked about it after he found out. I mean, he never was able to tell his father that he had a grandchild.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it drove him crazy. But he contained himself. He never talked about it. And then he died when I was 20. And I was, up until that point, not smart enough to ask him. Although he was the grown up, but I was the one in college at that point. And so I never asked, and he never said. And you don't mind if we go into this story
No.
in just like this? Because I am Jewish, and we do Passover every April, and we tell the Exodus story every year. And my father never told me his. And
Yeah.
so it's almost like it's an institutionalized requirement, but he just never said. He just never. So I
Maybe
don't.
maybe it was too much for him to
I
kind
I
of.
I don't doubt that, but and it wasn't until I got much older, because I'm a Buffalo Soldier historian, and I'm a DoD. I worked in the Department of Defense. I wrote stuff on Israeli air bases. I wrote stuff on Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I wrote about operations in the 90s. Okay, so I didn't get to writing about Hungary and thinking really about Hungary until after the Cold War ended, and I was actually able to go back there because I was a DoD historian, and they weren't letting me back into a communist country to see where my parents came from.
Mm-hmm.
So my own inquisitiveness about this part of my parents' experience dates from the time I would say 60 years old, and I retired in 2003, maybe when I was 50 years old in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you had time to kind of think about it
And
and
I
process.
actually and I went back with my mother in 1991, right after the Cold War ended, and they let me go back. You have to get permission from the security crowd before you do that kind of travel. They let me go back, and I kind of discovered accidentally that this place meant a lot more to me than I thought it might. I never cared about going back. But when I was walking on the streets in the morning, and Hungary and Budapest was having mayoral elections, and I heard Hungarian all around me. And my native language is Hungarian because that's what my parents spoke, and I didn't really become an English speaker till kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard Hungarian all around me, I had this deep emotional surge that I experienced. And I learned a big thing. I learned that I belonged there. I learned that I belonged there, that this was my home. The language was my home. Yet I also knew at that point that this country had not done right by my family. And so what was emerging was a kind of a love-hate relationship. So, uh, and so we did go back there. My wife and I lived there for 15 years, part-time, and I did do research. I published a book called Hungarian Borderlands in 2011. I published my second book, The Past Is Not Past, last November, as the Budapest Holocaust Museum published it, and it's now being published in a revised edition and made available. These guys are horrible at marketing, and they didn't. And so I own the copyright, and I'm just now at a contractual stage with Peter Lang, a a well-known international academic publisher, to get an edition out where actually my book will be available on Amazon. I mean, the Budapest, the Holocaust Museum, they mean well, but this is Orban's Hungary, and they don't have any money to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So, I've had this interesting, to me, complicated relationship with Hungary that's kind of driven me in a lot of ways. But it also actually, and I'm going to get you back into our original subject if you don't mind. It also kind of drove me when it came time to think about military service, because I didn't know at the time that the U.S. had been very chary in allowing Jewish people in at that time. It was very difficult. I didn't know how lucky my parents were to actually manage to get into this country in 1939. All I knew was that I was the first college graduate in my family, and that I was free and able to contemplate a future, a life without fear, but yeah, you know, it seemed to me the perfectly logical, rational thing to do. Uh, the politics of the war aside, if I was going into the army, and my only choice that I perceived within that framework was, do I let them draft me, or do I go to ROTC in college and come out with a commission and do it that way? And that's what I did. So in 1965, I became a second lieutenant in the United States Army, and I had no problems uh, with that decision. I owed this country for what I was becoming, and I was very grateful. I mean, it's just that's how it was. And then later on, I came back and I went to graduate school. I began to look at the Vietnam War differently, but I was never ashamed or embarrassed by what I did.
Hmm.
And that's one reason why when you publish this notice, I just say I ought to talk to you, because I don't know how many people reflect this view. I think I certainly am not alone, but that's my view of military service to Vietnam. I came home and I got called a murderer on the University of Maryland campus. Okay, uh, you know, that was a different world than the world that from which I went into the army. So,
Hmm.
you know, and but yeah, I had no problem. I had no problem serving in that war.
Well, let's back it up and talk about your parents some more.
Okay.
So, what did they do when they got to the US? How did they make a living?
Okay. Um, Neither one of them spoke English. Neither one of them had more than a fourth or sixth grade education. We did have relatives in New Jersey, and who were key to us getting here, because in those days, if there was no one here to sign an affidavit saying you would not become a public charge, you were not getting in this country.
Hmm.
So we had relatives there to kind of ease the cultural transition into this country. Um, Father got a job at the New York Athletic Club as a busboy, and it kind of shaped where he was going from there. I mean, he had no skills, and not even, you know. Then they found an apartment in Washington Heights. I've been back there. I went back there with my father and had a baked apple in the restaurant where he used to go, and I had baked apple because he told me the story. The first two words he could read on a menu were baked apple, and so and so that's what. Uh, so he ate a lot of baked apples, and he was working in jobs like that. My mother was working in some kind of a toy factory, assembling harmonicas. And actually, that was the only time she ever worked. Uh, Once I was born, she stayed at home. And in 1942, uh, there was a significant group of Hungarians in Washington, not connected to my father, except he had one or two acquaintances in this group, who were domestic help at the Hungarian embassy, chambermaids, waiters, and that kind of stuff. And when Hungary declared war on the United States, a lot of these people asked for asylum and they stayed here. And so those ultimately became my parents' social group, because one of those guys from that group wrote to my father in New York, saying, Washington is just bustling. Waiters are needed here, and you can make a lot of money in this town.
Hmm.
Washington, of course, was. I mean, money was flowing like crazy. Government and contractors. I mean, the war was on, and my father got a job at the Boardman Park Hotel, later the Sheraton Park, and was still working there. He was running room service when he died in 1964.
Hmm.
And my mother reared me and my sister, essentially. And so I am a Washingtonian. By the time I was born, they were here. We're in Virginia now, you and I. but by here I mean in the Washington area. And there's so much irony, I guess. I'm not saying my life is singular, just what I know about it is laced with irony because we had an apartment on Wyoming Avenue in the Adams Morgan section of Washington, and we lived there until 1949, and I was by then starting school. And my mother saw out on the porch one day, looked out in the back, and there were black people around. She said, "We got to move."
Mm.
Mother, who was a Jewish refugee, saw somebody else who was strange and decided we had to move. So we moved to Tacoma Park, DC, up by the Silver Spring line, and that's really where I grew up in northwestern Washington. And of course, I wound up going to a historically black college. I mean, sometimes when I think about the turns that life takes, my head wants to explode because this. I mean, I did not grow up in a family that they adapted to my scholarship. They adapted when Howard offered me a 4-year academic scholarship. They decided, well, that wasn't too bad.
Yeah.
But it was really the whole thing was kind of weird.
Well, where did you go to high school?
I went to Calvin Coolidge High School in Washington, D.C., a public school that was at that point 1/3 black.
And integrated.
Yeah, well, desegregated. Not sure it was integrated. Actually, what it was really in was a transitional period because people like my parents were moving to Montgomery County.
Mm-hmm.
By the time I was in high school, we were one of the last families. In fact, my mother didn't move until I was in the Army. I went to Howard. My father died while I was a student. My mother stayed in that duplex until maybe the 70s. She lived to be 88 years old. She died in 1998, and so we were among the last white families to leave our block. Not for any political reasons. There was inertia and convenience, and the house was paid for. But so my mother, I guess I could tell you the story about when my son was born. I don't know because when I called my mother, I was a graduate student at the University of Wyoming. I was the first black graduate student. I think I mentioned that in the history department after I got out of the Army, and I called my mother to tell her that she was going to be a mother-in-law and a grandmother at the same time. And my mother's question was not, is she Jewish? My mother's question was, is she white?
Mm.
So,
And you said that, now I want to clarify that the University of Wyoming thought you were a black candidate because you were coming from Howard University, which was a historically black university.
No question about it, and they were candid about it. They were verbal about it, and not only was I from an HBC, but I was also 3 years an Army officer, which gets back to the Vietnam War in a way. And so I was in 1968. This was an important conservative credential. But I wasn't going to wear a dashiki and carry a spear. I wasn't going to burn buildings down. I wasn't going to radicalize all these poor young girls who from small towns in Bighorn Basin who'd come to the big town of Laramie, Wyoming, population 18,000, to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was teaching as a graduate student. So I was there kind of a black student. Turned out a little bit different, but like full of ironies and surprises.
Yeah. It's also kind of funny to think about that you would be corresponding through paper and maybe you spoke to someone on the phone, but they never would have physically been able to see you or your race prior to you arriving.
Yeah, well, in those days, I applied to graduate school from Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
I was on a 2-year commitment, and I was going to get out in the spring of 1967 from Vietnam and be able to go to school the subsequent year. So I applied to graduate schools from Vietnam that preceding year, which was not an easy thing to do. The mails being what they are, I'm writing from an APO, an Army Post Office in Vietnam, and and by the time I was getting ready to go home, nobody had responded to any of my applications.
Mm.
And I thought, I'm not going home unemployed and looking for a job. So I extended for 15 months to the summer of 1968. And I got home, and a couple weeks later, I got a letter from the University of Wyoming offering me a graduate assistantship. So that was kind of funny, you know. I went downtown to the Department of the Army and said, hey, I changed my mind. I don't want to stay in the Army anymore. They thought that was pretty funny. And I served the 15 months that I was committed to. And also, my friends here who were more sensitive and smarter about this than I was said, you know, they think you're black, and you write to them and tell them what's happening, and they're going to do right by you. And I did that. I wrote to them saying this is the circumstance, and they said, well, write us next spring if you're still interested, and we'll see what the situation is. And that's what I did, and they renewed their offer, and I went to Laramie, Wyoming.
So when you re-enlisted or re-upped your
Extended,
commitment,
yes.
extended,
Yeah.
did they say that you could serve in the U.S. or were they going to send you back to Vietnam?
No, well, the Vietnam was a 1-year tour.
Okay.
And I was nearing the end of that 1-year tour and the end of my 2-year commitment at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I would have got out. They would have released me from active duty with 22 months. But I just wasn't having that because I didn't want to come home and try to figure things out. I mean, I'd been out of the country for a whole year, and so it was logical for me. I mean, I did not dislike the Army. I did not have any problem serving in that Army, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, anything. I thought the Army treated me well, and you know, so this was not a Hobson's choice. This was not terrible. It was not bad. So I stayed another year. So they assigned me to Fort Meade, Maryland, which is right up the road from here,
Mm-hmm.
to the office of the Post G4. I was in supply. And I started graduate school part-time at night at the University of Maryland, which just got me back into an academic environment, and of course got me called a murderer for the first time in my life. You know, which was, you know, because I'd go to school. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Were you wearing your uniform, or did they just know you and you said you had been serving?
No, I was naive and stupid enough to leave work at Fort Meade, get in my car, in my uniform, and go to school. You know, because I didn't have time to change. I had this class. I was only taking one class a semester. I was just getting back into it. And so yeah, I was wearing my uniform. I was a captain of the United States Army. I'm supposed to be embarrassed by that? You know, come on. So that's the way it happened. And maybe I wasn't paying attention. Maybe I didn't know what the country was, how the country had evolved. But I learned it. I learned it, and I never internalized that, of course, because I wasn't the murderer. I was a supply officer in Vietnam, and so I knew it was happening all around. So I didn't take it personally, of course, and I did not internalize it, and it never bothered me until 1990 or 89, with Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, at that time, I was managing the writing of a book on that war, a book called Whirlwind War, and I was the general editor that the Army Center of Military History was doing. And I was in charge of that project. I had 8 historians working for me, 4 civilians and 4 officers. And we all did sections, and I put it all together, made it coherent. And actually, we produced a pretty damn good book. And it's been translated into Japanese and Portuguese by the military universities of Brazil and Japan. So it's a pretty highly respected book. And but at the time, right after the war, the committee that was doing a parade, a celebratory parade for the service members coming home from the Gulf, was in my building. It was in the Navy Yard here in Washington. And that's when it got me. So, holy shit, this was a 4-day ground war, and we're doing a parade.
Mm-hmm.
And I come home from this grimy, awful, and I did not have a grimy, awful experience, but I come home from this war that seared thousands and thousands of lives, and I'm called a murderer. I said, what is wrong with this picture?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it became problematic for me to have been called and considered a murderer. That somehow the whole sense of perspective was gone. And I just, it just kind of blew me away. And I resented the hell out of that. I mean, you might be able to tell, even 30 years later, this really, really bothered me. Yeah, they had their parade, and what's his name? I can't even remember. The 4-star General Schwarzkopf. Schwarzkopf was a national hero and all this stuff. And and gas prices went down. Okay, so I just it's hard not to be cynical about the whole thing. So that's that my experience in Maryland back to 1967, 68. I learned to make time to change my clothes. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it sensitized me on a personal level to what was going on in this country. Yeah.
Did you have any perception of the protests when you were in Vietnam?
No, I did not. The only newspaper that we had access to was Stars and Stripes, and radio news from Armed Forces Radio. The Chicago Tribune, which was a pretty much right-wing newspaper at the time, did offer free subscriptions to people in Vietnam, but those papers came 2 and 3 and 4 weeks late because they got there, and so no, I didn't. I got out of the country once to go to Taipei on an R&R for 5 days. That didn't, provide a conduit for information. And no, it just no.
Mm-hmm. Can we go back to what year did you graduate from high school?
1961.
1961.
Yes.
And then you applied to universities and colleges?
Well, I was. You're asking good questions. I was really a naive kid, and I did not have college-educated family. I was in an accelerated academic track. I was pretty good at school when I put my mind to it, but that's another story. And I was a senior, and I think it was in October of 1960, and I hadn't applied to any colleges. I didn't know how to apply to colleges. Maybe I would have learned how to apply to colleges. I don't know. But it was a Saturday, and it was raining, and so I couldn't play tennis. So I took this scholarship test at Howard. And I got offered a 4-year academic scholarship. I did tests pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got to Howard.
Do you know how many white students they accepted that year in your class?
No, anecdotally, I'd say very, very few. There was another white kid. We're still friends. He's a professor of chemistry, retired from the University of Rhode Island. Louis and I were from Calvin Coolidge High School. Were white and got scholarships. He took the test too, um, and I could see on campus there were some white kids. Anecdotally, again, they tended to be Jewish and they tended to be from New York. Uh, and in the professional schools, there was a considerably larger number because Howard was an exceptional value,
Mm-hmm.
cheap, you know. But it was one of the most fortunate things that ever happened to me in so many ways. I mean, in terms of who I became and what I was exposed to. I was just telling Irene the other day. I'm reading an article in the New Yorker by about the first woman to translate Homer's Odyssey, named
Mm-hmm.
Emily Wilson, and the woman who wrote the article talked about following Emily Wilson to the beach in Ithaca in Greece and seeing the wine colored sea that Odysseus described in, in the Homer described in the Odyssey. And I remember my first time in Athens in 1980. I was on a research trip to Israel, come back, and I'm in a hotel, and I wake up in the morning, and there's the rosy-fingered dawn that I had read about in the Odyssey. I almost went crazy with delight. And but the point is, I read the Odyssey because at Howard they required me to read the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I got a good education, and from Homer to Lawrence Ferlinghetti, I was reading poetry uh, that I would never have encountered without the liberal arts education I got at Howard. It was a good school. It was a damn good school. And I was very lucky to go there. I decided to become a history major. My father thought I should uh, study sciences because I could become a dentist, and dentists own shopping centers. But but I just that's why you go to school, to discover who you are and who you are not. And you know, but as a history major, I had to take Black history. It's Howard, and they required 2 semesters of the Negro to 1877, end of Reconstruction, and the Negro since 1877. Had to take those courses to have a major in history at Howard. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's beginning of the path that I followed because I have 5 books on Buffalo soldiers. This is what I did when I wasn't working for DOD, you know. So it was absolutely a pivotal, critical experience. And of course, that set me on the path to Wyoming, where I met my wife and where I uh, started writing about Buffalo soldiers and publishing scholarly articles. So you know the whole thing about Howard and Vietnam. That's a pivotal period in whatever it's worth. It's in who I am.
Well, how did it feel to almost be? I mean, you were in the minority. I know that you're Jewish, so maybe you had an
I'm just
experience of being a cultural minority, but
yeah.
going to a school and being the minority race, how did that feel?
uh, I felt uh, perfectly normal. I was president of the debating team for 2 years, and I was the operations officer of the ROTC brigade when I was a senior. And I, you know, and of course, and dated Black women, which of course is what set my mother in a panic. And for the I think the remarkable thing about that is not that I found those women interesting, is that they found me interesting, and I had what I considered a normal social life and a very stimulating academic life at Howard. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
um, I never felt threatened or in danger, and I never questioned, well, if I did I make the right decision to go here? I never did.
Mm-hmm.
I, I liked it. I really did. I really did. Sterling Brown is one of the most brilliant black poets. Taught me a short story course. I mean, I got it was just a really good education.
So did you start out in the ROTC from your freshman year?
Oh, absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely. 2 years were required, and
Okay.
so the pivotal thing was after your sophomore year, and of course, and then I was in this figuring out this equation that then it was 1964 or three, and they were going to get me. I was going to be at draft age. I was going to my 2S deferment was going to expire when I got my degree, and what was I going to do about it? And so I went into the advanced ROTC program, which was a commitment to serve uh, on active duty after graduation.
Do you To go back a little bit, do you remember when you first heard about the Vietnam War and the U.S. involvement, um, even before you're going to actually serve? Do you remember when you heard about it?
I sort of, Bernard Fall, who wrote some excellent monographs, some excellent studies on the French experience in Indochina, was a professor of political science at Howard, and and I knew about Fall and I knew about his work, and through that I was aware of some of the things that were going on in Indochina. But 1965, when I was a second lieutenant, just fresh into the uh, Army. I was at Fort Lee, Virginia. It's no longer called Fort Lee, as
Mm-hmm.
you well know. Good riddance to the name. Uh, uh, at the Quartermaster Officers Basic Course, and I think it was then. There was, and I'm not sure, but it's a long time ago. But I think it's then that I remember watching Lyndon Johnson on TV saying he wasn't going to send American boys to do what Asian boys are supposed to be doing. And so Vietnam was not really on my personal radar. But after I finished at Fort Lee, I was assigned to Aberdeen Proving Ground, which of course is also right up the road in Maryland, just north of Baltimore. I thought, it's not what I signed on for. I didn't just sign on for staying in my own neighborhood. My world was between Boston and Miami, and nothing off the eastern seaboard. I didn't sign on for that. So I volunteered for Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
I volunteered for Vietnam because it was a sure way to get me somewhere that I hadn't been. And so uh, I went to Vietnam in April of 1966, the end of April 1966. And to get there, uh, I drove to California with an Army major, a black man, who was a combat veteran in Korea, and Leon Eskridge, major. And we drove his Thunderbird across the United States. And so I started to see something of the world.
And then did you leave from San Francisco?
Yeah, Oakland Army, Travis Air Force Base, which is 30, 40 miles away. I got out there a week ahead of time, and those, so I spent a week touring San Francisco. I watched Willie Mays play center field for the San Francisco Giants, and went to museums. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. It was just kind of, it was all a big adventure.
Mm-hmm. Did you notice any of the counterculture in San Francisco while you were going around, or was it too?
No, I did not. I did not. It's a good question. I hadn't thought about it. Uh, I was a tourist among tourists. Um, I had civilian clothes. I mean, I wasn't hiding. I would not have thought to hide my military connection at that point. Uh, this was April of '66, and we were just starting to be committed on a very large scale. And so the opposition to the war was not something I noticed. It just wasn't. I don't know whether I should have or not.
Hmm. What about your mother? Because I guess your father had died by this point.
My father died in 1964.
So
Yeah,
her only son is going off to war.
yeah. She didn't. I don't know. She never articulated anything about it. My father, I know, he died when I was in my junior year at Howard. My father, I could feel that this was why he did what he did, that he felt really rewarded. I was going to graduate from college and I was going to become an officer in the United States Army. And I think he felt validation by this. Even though in a lot of levels we did not understand each other. He was always a European and I was always an American. And there was some tension uh, between his traditional ways and modernity. That's all, you know. My son was born in 1969. Well, you know, we had the same we had the same issues.
Yeah.
So
Did
yeah, I'm sorry.
oh so no, excuse me.
I
You
don't.
can okay. Um so did you when you graduated from Howard, you weren't really were you thinking about your future in the army? Were you considering a career or were you thinking you were going to go on and go to graduate school?
No, I was never thinking about a career in the army. I never did. Uh, I thought it was important to do it. It was entirely reasonable to do it, but I viewed it as a time to think about my next step. I did want to go to graduate school. I did want a career in history, and I did think at the time that that meant an academic career because that's about what historians do. They become professors, and I really had no idea that a career in the Department of Defense or any other government agency was also a possibility for me. Uh, which it turned out to be a wonderful choice, I thought, uh, because I could do history, I could do research, and I could write, and I did not have to teach undergraduates.
Hmm.
And I never taught until I had a Fulbright in Romania in 2003. It was the only year that I actually taught in the university. I mean, I've done lectures, you know, real people. But
Hmm.
that's what no, I never. I mean, I'm not even sure where I started on this track, Laura. What the original question you asked me was.
Oh, if you thought about a career and
Yeah, yeah, okay. And I think that does answer your question.
yeah.
I was looking for a career in history. You know, I did my PhD at the University of Toledo, and Bill Leckie, who had written a book about Buffalo Soldiers in 1967, a book called The Buffalo Soldiers, which fired the imagination of a lot of people and was a really good book, but it didn't go the way I was going to go. I could see that really early, and but I got a fellowship to go to Toledo to work under Leckie, and uh, even at that time, I was still thinking, well, you know, it's an academic career that I'm heading for. My wife, who retired from the Library of Congress, was then a university librarian. And I was always afraid at Toledo that, like he kept saying, you know, I'll get you a job, I'll get you a job. I was always afraid he would because his connections were in Oklahoma and Texas. I didn't want to do that, and I was already knew that rather than interview for a job at Gila Monster A&M or whatever is out there, uh, I was going to have to decline his help. But he never came through, never delivered, and things worked out much much better for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what were your units of assignment during your military career?
Well, uh, my assignments in the U.S. and which were Aberdeen Proving Ground before Vietnam and Fort George Meade after Vietnam were assignments to the garrison, which was because of the region it was in. It was in First Army's region. At that time, I don't know how things were organized anymore. At that time, that's how the East Coast was First Army, the West Coast was Sixth Army, and then in between there were so they were garrison assignments. When I went to Vietnam, I was assigned to what was called First Logistical Command, which was the overarching logistical uh, did the overarching logistical functions that supported Army troops and others in the country. And within First Log, there were three support commands at Saigon and Cam Bay and Queen Yan. And I was assigned to a sub area. Actually, it was called, when I got there, it was called Nha Trang uh, Support Command, which was near Cam Bay, but it was on its way to being organized out of existence and becoming a subunit of Cam Bay Support Command. Cam Bay was a huge base and port, and I'm sure you know about that. And I spent my whole year in Nha Trang as a headquarters supply officer. That I was responsible for this stuff that my headquarters requisitioned and used. I maintained property accounts and I requisitioned stuff. I did all that bureaucratic. It was bureaucratic work,
Mhm.
and it was not particularly challenging. But I was 23 years old, and maybe that was just right for what I was doing. I also had the arms room was attached to my supply room and that kind of stuff. And I lived in town. It was almost like I lived in a villa that we rented with about 8 or 10 other company grade, that's lieutenants and captains, officers, who were in the headquarters and related activities. And it was kind of like an Animal House existence. We drank a lot of beer, we played a lot of poker, we did other things, and it didn't have the look of a war zone.
Mhm.
The war was not far. Sometimes you could hear the war, but I think, and I may be wrong, of course, but I think Nha Trang may have been an area that the Viet Cong used as well as we used. And it was kind of like a water hole where the carnivores and the omnivores both drink from the same water hole. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think that because I remember one day we were right on the South China Sea, and Madame New, who was I think the sister of Vice Premier Key, I
Mhm.
think, had a villa on top of the hill just south of town where there was a restaurant where you could get great lobster. I mean, it was just, uh, but we'd go to the beach on our half day off every week. And at least once I do remember being in the water and making eye contact with guys who were rinsing their black pajamas in the water. And I just felt the anger, the loathing in that guy's eyes. And it just seemed to me that what I was seeing here was the other side using the same breach.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, because I'll never know whether that was true, but I think that might have been one reason why Nha Trang was never a focus of military operation until I left there in '67, until later on that year, maybe within 2 months of after I left, there was an attack on Nha Trang. And it was fended off. But I was there the whole time, except when I had to do things like go off to Saigon to essentially run errands for colonels. And I did that a couple of times, and of course that was just as bizarre, and even more so because you could go up to one of those hotels that we leased and go up on the roof at night and sit there and watch an American movie and drink a beer and see the tracer bullets out beyond where the war was. Totally bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
Totally bizarre.
Two different worlds.
Yeah,
existing.
right. That's right. That's right. So there were people literally within earshot of me getting killed on both sides, I'm sure, and people who are not on either side also getting killed.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so there were things about Vietnam that were just so weird. It was so strange. But personally, the only time I felt in danger was that insane time when I went on R&R to Taipei, uh, because the day before I left, when I was in my room in our villa, the address was 33 Dong Da, and I had a wad of American money in my wardrobe because we functioned with military payment certificates because green dollars were a hot black market item, and so we just didn't get green dollars until we're going on R&R. You could convert a few $100 and take them with you, and so I had in my wardrobe a wad of money, real money, and it was locked with a padlock. And I had between my wardrobe and my bed, my desk, because I had just one room, my desk and a chair. And on my chair was my web belt with a holster and a 45 caliber bullets in it,
Mm-hmm.
which was kind of a dumb thing to have because we never, but we were soldiers. We were told. So I wake up in the middle of the night and there's somebody in my room, a young male, and he has found my keys on my desk and opened my wardrobe. And that is the point at which I woke with a start and he ran.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And I followed him as far as I was on the second floor of this house. Uh, there was a walkway around, and all the rooms faced the center courtyard. They weren't connected to each other. And the last time I saw him, he was running out of our driveway and fleeing toward the street. And I mean, in the time that he took to find my keys and open that wardrobe, he could have blown my brains out.
Mm-hmm.
And I, on the other hand, if I had the presence of mind, could have pursued him with my 45 and killed him. So two things happened the next day. I put my pistol in the arms room and I never got it out again unless I was told to. And I went off to Taiwan. And that's the only time I felt that I was anything really close being in harm's way. And that's just like experiencing a robbery on the street here.
Mm-hmm.
It's closer to that than being in a war.
Yeah.
And that was the only time I was actually in harm's way. That's and that's one reason why I wanted to talk to you. Maybe the main reason why I thought, well, I should put some of this on a record because uh, we all didn't get post traumatic stress disorder. We all didn't risk our lives. Uh, we all didn't kill anybody. Uh, but we were there, and there were a lot of us whose experience was like mine, as well as those who had the much more difficult and more onerous and more risky uh, experience as soldiers.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the message that I wanted to convey in this conversation, about Vietnam. We all didn't have the same Vietnam. You different.
And there are many jobs in
Yeah.
running a army.
Yeah, right.
Keeping it running.
Yeah, what they tend to call tooth and tail, and there's all kind of they're always talking about the ratio between the tooth, which is the combat side, and the tail, which is one that supports it. And there are just a lot of us. There are a lot of people like us who served in headquarters, who may in one way or another were useful to the war effort, but who did not really experience war. That's
like the movie, like how the movies portray it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's.
Did you ever consider joining another branch of the military?
Well, no. Howard had Air Force and Army ROTC, and those were my real choices. No, I really didn't. It wasn't I don't know why I just happened to wind up in Army ROTC. Maybe because of my interest in history and they did they did teach an Army version of it was part of the curriculum. I don't know why. Not everything you do when you're 19 has an explanation. Maybe not everything you do when you're 80 has one either, but certainly when you're 19.
Yeah. Did you ever want to take any kind of like further training in the military for some sort of, it seems like a lot of people, the way they test, it sends them on a trajectory within the military.
Yeah. I never saw the military as anything but a transition or transitory or short time thing for me. And part of it, when you get an ROTC commission, it's a reserve commission. So I was in the U.S. Army Reserve, and I was on active duty for 2 years. And it's even by the time that I was getting ready to get out in the spring of 1968, they were already reducing the force.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not see the Army as a tenable long-term prospect as an ROTC graduate in the U.S. Army Reserve. Even if I wanted to stay, and I didn't want to stay. I had a good experience in the Army, but I never really saw it as something I wanted to do, go into advanced training in any way. I was a lieutenant and then a captain in what they call the quartermaster corps, which is a distinctively focused on logistics. Some of us used to call it the Jewish infantry, but that's.
So did you feel like there were more Jewish people in the no?
No, I didn't feel that. It was just kind of a joke. That's all.
Okay.
That's all.
How did you observe your religious practices while you were in Vietnam? Were you able to do that?
No, and I didn't really care. I guess you'd say secular to the bone. And it's been a long time since I've been in a synagogue. Uh, uh, because of the way the world is, my Jewish identity is inescapable, and I don't resent that. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of what we have done as a family and as a people, despite everything. But I have trouble with the idea of God, and I have always had that kind of trouble. So when people, ask me about my religion, I just, I'm a secular Jew,
Hmm.
and actually I pass for white, and that's what Jewish people do in this country. They pass for white if they choose to. Because, there's no question that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and it is problematic. Even if you're not practicing, it's not humane. It's not rational. It's destructive on all counts. I just I feel my identity, but I just you know I feel better not going to synagogue. Sometimes it's funny because I do think about this, and obviously I have some ambivalence. Sometimes I do crave the company of Jews, but my wife is a Unitarian, so we're even though she's white, we are still a mixed marriage, and she doesn't practice a faith either, and when Max was a little boy, our son is a little boy, is 53 years old, and it it seemed to people to be a real important question. Well, how are you going to raise the kid? As if this is something you just had to answer, and we just he'll work it out, and he works it out. He doesn't go to a church or a synagogue either. Uh,
Yeah. But it's nice to give them a choice,
yeah,
to kind of give them learn all of the different types and then make your choice.
yeah. Well, Irene did expose him to some years of RE, religious education, at the local Unitarian church here in Mount Vernon. Uh,
Hmm.
and he's a college graduate, and he's an IT professional, and he's literate. He make his own choices,
Hmm.
and we always felt comfortable with that. Um, but, being Jewish there are a lot of different levels or ways of being Jewish in this country.
Yeah. Things are always more complicated. We always try to simplify things to understand them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's probably true.
Well, let me ask you a question about what was your first impression after leaving San Francisco and arriving in Vietnam? What was your first impression of the country?
Well, that's an interesting question. I had read Catch 22 before while I was in college. I had read Catch 22, and so I knew that uh, logic wasn't necessarily the driving force in the military. Even before I had experienced it directly. But you fly in from San Francisco, actually from Travis by way of Alaska, and because these were 707s, the trip was a little longer and needed a little bit more stopping for fuel. So we flew from Travis to somewhere, I don't remember where in Alaska, to Japan, to Tansanut.
Hmm.
And then we were bused to a place called Camp Alpha, which was a huge sprawling tent camp. And we threw down our bags and said, "Here we are." And I managed. Somehow I got the feeling that I could have spent my whole year there and nobody would have known it. was really weird. I didn't want to do that because that's, I mean, there's dumb and there's dumber, and I can't think of anything dumber than staying in a cot in a tent in Camp Alpha outside. But it just felt like nobody was in charge, and I didn't know nobody had, there I didn't nobody had said, oh, this is what you do to get to where you're supposed to go. And I really I I figured it out myself. Uh, and I don't remember any organizational details, but somehow I got myself, nobody said do this or you should do this. I got myself to a tent where they were issuing uh, essentially tickets, transportation to your duty station. And I went in there and I told them I had to go to Net Trang, and they said, "Oh, Net Trang." And then I got uh, space on, I don't know if it was a C-130 or a C-123 at this point anymore, on an aircraft to Net Trang, and I got there. And I just always had the feeling, and obviously I still do, that if I hadn't done anything, I'd still be a kid. It really was strange, but the operation had seemed to me, and I was 22, 23, and a baby in terms of the military. I was just a new second lieutenant, 10 months. Uh, the operation had so outgrown the capacity to manage it seemed to me, that nothing was happening right. And so I managed to get on this plane, and there were others on the plane, and I don't know how they got on, but one of them or another of them, and I don't even remember any of their names anymore, seemed to have arranged for ground transportation. And so we managed to get from there, because we were all different organizations in that train, to where we were going, and then I managed to get a place to sleep. And it's just crazy. It was just crazy. It was interesting. I hadn't thought about it for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Most people, they talk about the heat and the smell, that it was so hot and it smelled so badly.
Well, it was hot and it was humid, and the weather was a problem. Um, in terms of personal comfort, what I remember more than that was the water.
Mm-hmm.
If you were as careful, even if you were only using ice cubes in an officer's club, even if you were only eating in an official government mess, although we did go out, there was a really nice restaurant called Forgot on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
Simple, steak and frites kind of French food, but it was really nice. Sooner or later, you got diarrhea, and it was serious. And so there were a lot of us who just didn't wear underwear because you could get to be in a hurry real fast.
Yeah.
And that's what I remember about that kind of stuff. I do remember, we had personal Jeeps. There were M151s that we used to get around, and I'll tell you, the official reason for having that Jeep was there was a Camp McDermott by the airbase where supplies were stashed. I mean, we were in a headquarters office, but you have to have warehouses, right? And we didn't have warehouses. We had Connex containers. These are these corrugated metal boxes that things are shipped in, and they're stacked. And they're only stacked too high, but they're stacked. And they got, this one's got uniforms in it. This one's got boots in it. This one's got kitchen gear in it. This one's got office gear in it. This one has ammunition in it. I mean, they're all over the place. And the only way I, as a supply officer, I learned this just from observation actually, could keep tab of what the hell we had when we got a requisition was to go out there once a week and drive around and open the goddamn Connex containers and see what was in them. So I had this Jeep, and I do remember during the monsoon season having water in my lap. That's where this came from, because the rains were incredible.
Mm-hmm.
The heat, the heat and the humidity, okay, the heat and the humidity, but the rains were incredible, and the diarrhea was an issue. Those were,
I
those,
have to I have to tell you a side note that we spoke to someone and they had diarrhea as well. They were out in the jungle, but their mother would send them care packages and they kept sending them Pepto-Bismol like
uh,
over and over again. And at some point he was like, "Mom, why do you keep sending me Pepto-Bismol? I don't have diarrhea anymore." And apparently she was sending him alcohol disguised in the Pepto-Bismol container and he just kept like throwing it away.
oh, well, that just raises the issue, or raises my awareness of how interesting this must be for you, because you're getting all kinds of stories.
Yeah.
How many interviews have you done?
I think we're around 20 now.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
you just kind of get, all sorts of different experiences.
The thing about alcohol that I remember is that alcohol and tobacco were so cheap, and they were like perks.
Government subsidy.
Yeah, in the PX, a carton of cigarettes, a carton that's 10 packs, was $2. $2. And so, I mean, they didn't come out and say you ought to smoke or you ought to drink, but the stuff was really, really cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And
So did most people smoke? Did you smoke before you went to Vietnam?
I did, and I didn't stop till I was 40. Uh, but but it was just absolutely astonishing to me. This was a benefit of being in the Army. Why didn't cigarettes? That was pretty dumb.
Yeah.
It was dumb.
Um, so how did you keep in touch with your family while you were there?
Through the mail. Through the mail. I had a girlfriend, and the one thing I remember about corresponding with Lois was she sent me a big Hebrew National salami once, and it survived. It's got a lot of preservatives, and and so one night in our villa, we had a salami fest. That's all. 10 guys can do a salami in. Yeah. I kept in touch with them. My sister wrote me letters. My mother wrote me letters. Some of my friends wrote me letters. I never felt isolated. I certainly never felt that they turned their backs on me because of what I was doing. I never felt anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But until you raised the question, it never didn't prey on my mind at all. I didn't even think about it. It just wasn't. The mails worked for us. The mail from us was free. That was, you just wrote free in the top right-hand corner of an envelope, and
Mm-hmm.
and it got to where it was going. So,
Did you
I'm sorry?
did you ever try to make a phone call?
No, I didn't. I think some of the guys did. I don't know how the phones were amazingly primitive, even in country, even the tactical phones, from switchboard to switchboard to switchboard, and all handled by human beings. Doing this and doing that. It was the phones were not. I don't know how guys did it if they did it.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have a wife, and I didn't have anybody I was committed to, or who was committed to me, and it wasn't an imperative, you know. Uh, I was welcomed back by my friends with open arms, and when I came home, it was a big deal. But and so nobody was alienated from me by because of what I had done. In my social group, by the way, all Jewish guys, basically a group that was formed in AZA, which is a B'nai B'rith youth organization fraternity. Uh, and so these guys I went back at least through at least to high school with. None of these guys, they all avoided what I had just done.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't mean anything on a personal level. One became a dentist and he served in Turkey, good duty. One became a DC National Guard member and never left the neighborhood, and the rest of them managed to avoid it. So okay, that was what they did. I did something different. So in some ways, I was a real kind of a freak in the group, but there were never any moral judgments made based on that. I never felt that.
Do you think because of the Holocaust and World War II that maybe your community had more of a sense of patriotism than maybe other communities?
Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose it's possible. I know I did. I know I did. Uh, and I don't know how unusual. I felt. I'd go. I'd serve this country, but that was based on what we knew then. And I think if we had known what we know now about the U.S. government's lack of interest and about turning back ships that came with refugees and about adhering to minuscule quotas and lots of bureaucratic restrictions and requirements, maybe that would not have been the case. Maybe it would not have been the case. I felt a deep sense of obligation. I really did. It was very personal. I thought in my group of friends, I was the only one who was that close to our European origins for 4 years from the time they got here to the time I was born. So the others would not have viewed it quite the same way.
Mm-hmm.
You
Was there any kind of advantage to being in logistics? Like you were the guy who had shipping containers of boots. Like, in war, like you need basic things. Um, was there any kind of interesting story that you might have about being in charge of that?
Yeah, well, that's kind of like catch 22 too. Also, like Milo Binder said, everyone's a member of the syndicate and everyone owns a share. And yeah, there were certain trading going on. I could give the guy who was the distributor for San Miguel beer a case of frozen GI chicken, and he would give me a case of San Miguel beer. So yeah, no, there was some advantage to being a loggy, and I'm not the only one who saw the advantages.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we did that. I'm sure it was illegal, and maybe it could even be considered immoral. But I like beer better than chicken. But that's a good question because no, we did some of that. I mean, I knew where the coffee cups were. It's as simple as that. And everybody in the army got a desk and got a coffee cup and it's got his name on it. And I knew where the coffee cups were. And so I don't remember any explicit coffee cup transactions, but you could get stuff for coffee cups.
Who knew? Coffee cups.
Yeah, well, they're important. You spend 10, 12 hours a day at that desk. Try to do that without a coffee cup.
How was the coffee in Vietnam?
The coffee was excellent. It was awful. GI coffee uh, has a reputation. Where's that song of GI coffee? It's good for cuts and bruises. It tastes like iodine. I don't, I don't remember the name of the song, but uh, the food we had was good, but the coffee. I mean, there are two things with coffee. You have to have good coffee. You have to have somebody who knows how to make coffee. I mean, and decent equipment. So you have to have all that stuff. And so coffee and cigarettes kind of fueled the whole thing.
Endeavor.
Yeah.
Um, so did you ever see a donut dolly?
Yeah, yeah, but they weren't the big presence. What was a big presence was the USO
Mm-hmm.
in that train. Uh, I don't even know the donut dollies were Red Cross
Yeah.
women. Is that right?
Yeah.
They were not a significant presence to me, but the USO ran an operation, and it was an American civilian named Phil Cronin, and his deputy was a Filipino man named Emmer Manawis. I remember these guys very well because the USO was a refuge. You could always go, sometimes you just didn't feel like going to a bar. And they were good guys. We did a little trading too, as it happens,
Mm-hmm.
but in a different sort of way because I had access to the PX, and I remember Emmer needed a new briefcase, so I got him this briefcase. That kind of stuff went on.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but they they had movies, and they had a quiet place where you could read, and they had and coffee, and they were in a building in town outside of any compound. Never It was never treated as a threat or a threatened place, and it was always considered a safe place. And that's my memory of civilian support, uh, more than donut dollies, more than Red Cross women. Uh, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know.
Maybe they were more out in the field, um,
Yeah,
rather than being in the close in bases.
that may be true. There may have been more at places like San Rang, where the 101st had its headquarters, the 101st Airborne, which was still not tactically engaged on a personal level, but it was a combat unit.
Mm-hmm.
That's where guys came back when they rotated or for whatever reason, and maybe there you might find. I really don't know.
Mm-hmm. So your work week, what was it like?
Uh, because we were in a combat zone, what we were doing was important, and because what we were doing was important, we worked 6.5 days a week, and it was really dumb. It was really dumb. So we were in the office a lot,
Yeah.
and we had a half a day off every week. The guys who worked for me, if they kept their mouths shut, got a whole day because it was just dumb. We worked, I don't know, 10 to 12 hours. We didn't work. We stayed in the office 10 to 12 hours a day because what we were doing was important. And
So like 7 to 7, like 7 a.m. to 7
yeah,
p.m.
like that. It was dumb. It was dumb. Because there was no, work does not necessarily expand to fill the time allotted for it.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't. There's only so much you can do. We were a small headquarters supporting some units in the field and other units like the aviation unit that was in that train, for example, and other outfits that were in the local area. You know, and we were conscientious and we tried to be responsive, but it was
So what did you do for the half day or full day on Sunday? I assume that was a Sunday.
well, Sunday or Saturday. I only had about 5 or 6 enlisted people working for me at any given time, and as long as they were quiet about it, they could just get out. What I did, um, went, sometimes went to the beach. Uh, Very rarely ate in town, but frigates on the beach was good, and we visited whores, and we were all college graduates, at least people like me, and so we did read a book every once in a while. And it was there wasn't really a hell of a lot to do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I had one of the guys that I lived with was a civil affairs officer, and so he had some contacts with Vietnamese. We had Vietnamese civilians working with us, mainly administrative types and women who were clerk typists or something similar to that, and guys who were essentially gophers for lugging around supplies. But we very rarely, I didn't even have a meal once or twice in a Vietnamese home while I was there. Because through Jim Henderson, who was then the civil affairs officer at the headquarters, you there wasn't a hell of a lot to do. It really wasn't.
How did you feel about the South Vietnamese that you met?
Uh, I'm not sure I know how to answer your question, because I think I got along with people, but there were no relationships. We did have domestic help in our villa, which was like Animal House, and those poor women who because we drank a lot, we threw up, we did all kinds of stuff. Uh, uh, I don't know. That's an interesting question. How did we get along with the Vietnamese? Those, there, uh, there was the only time that I experienced uh, a, a strongly negative experience, terrible construction sentence there, was that time, that encounter on the beach with those guys staring at me.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't do much shopping in town because you didn't really want to. The restaurants were a little risky, not because of terrorism, but because the food was a little risky. There were a couple that we did eat at, and where nobody was known to have died. And so, besides prostitution and besides wait staff in restaurants, those were our main contacts, or mine certainly, and the domestics at our villa, the Vietnamese who worked for us at the headquarters. Yeah, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's been a long time, and so I'm not fully confident in my answer. I'm certainly not trying to hide anything from you, but I don't remember anything beyond that. I mean, there was nothing, and I don't remember ever thinking back and saying, I wonder what happened to, that such and such. I don't remember.
Did you have a sense of that these people were fighting for their country and you were helping them? Was there any kind of feeling that way?
Yeah, there was. I mean, the conceptually the enemy was North Vietnam and the ally was South Vietnam, and of course South Vietnam did exist at the time as a society with a government more or less of its own, propped up by the United States, of course. Uh, and yeah, we were that's what we were doing there. That's what we were doing there. Uh, Obviously, because we knew we were not totally naive about the Viet Cong. We knew there were significant elements of the southern population that despised us.
Mm-hmm.
But we thought we were helping a country. We really did think that. At least, yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. Uh, I don't remember. I don't remember anybody articulating the view that that society was going to collapse. But I was there in 66, 67. That's relatively early in the major American commitment. I don't remember, I mean, even our military guys, we had 2 Air Force advisory teams in Nha Trang, and they were assigned with the Vietnamese Air Force. So
Yeah.
there was an explicit connection with them, with their military. And in fact, at one point there was actually a Vietnamese officer who was billeted in our house, in Animal House. And so there were those kind of connections. Obviously, they were not sustainable, but that's from the perspective of now.
Mm-hmm.
When I left Vietnam, though, I left Vietnam. There was nothing. There was no connection, no human connection with the place. That even among my comrades, if you will, my fellow American soldiers, I only had a couple guys who I exchanged a couple letters with, and it was gone. It was gone. My whole army experience was like that. My best friends are from graduate school, and some from earlier, but the army, no.
Yeah. Hmm. And like the invention of Facebook didn't bring any of those people out of the weeds for you.
Say that again, please.
When the invention of Facebook, that didn't bring anybody, like they were like, oh, I've been looking for you, Mickey. Like
No, really. I can't. No.
hmm. Can you still hear me? Oh, we're paused. Okay. I
Okay.
lost you for a second there.
We lost each other. Yeah.
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 Um,
No. Connections with Vietnam is what we were talking about, basically.
yeah.
No. No.
Did you ever see, you talked about the USO and hanging out, but did you ever see any entertainers
Uh,
while you were
I did not. No, I must have. But I can't remember any. I can't remember any.
there? It's okay.
There was an Australian woman who was an exotic dancer. Okay, and I do remember her sticking her breast in my ear. It was part of her shtick. Okay, and
Uh-huh.
it was funny. This is what I remember, and I hadn't thought about this for 100 years, almost 100 years. The funny thing is about, this was a time when I really didn't want to be sexually excited. Obviously, she was not interested in me personally. I have no illusion about that. Because I was about ready to go home when this happened, and we had you pardon me for talking like this, but you triggered the memory. We had what we call the PCOD. Have you ever heard of the PCOD? The pussy cutoff.
Oh, uh-huh.
And so about a month before you went home, you stopped sexual activity. And I was well within, I apologize for,
No. We want you to tell us these things.
well, okay. So I was well within the 30 days. And I really was not interested in any stimuli like that as it happened because I was getting ready to go home. Not that I was getting ready to go home to anybody in particular. Actually, I had had a girlfriend, or at least I thought I did when I went to Vietnam. She was with somebody else when I came home. And that
She sent the salami and then she met someone else.
Yeah, that's right. At least she didn't abandon me before she sent the salami. And so,
But is the PCOD about sexual health, like that you're not bringing back diseases?
yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Which maybe is a good thing to know that we actually thought about things like that because we did. Uh, I had a bout with gonorrhea while I was there, and it was not an unusual thing to have happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I got treated, and everything works. So
Did they have education for soldiers about that?
I don't know. Not in logistical headquarters like mine. I don't know, and I don't know whether it varied from operational unit to operational unit, one division to another. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember ever encountering something like that. 65 is almost 60 years ago. Almost 60 years ago. And I'm sure you're taking that into account when you do these interviews, that our memories may not. I'm a historian and I know about oral history.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always reliable except on an anecdotal level.
Yeah, I mean, it's more about your memory, how your memories of what you experienced affected you.
Yeah.
But
Right.
you may not, it's not, it can't be like, well, they entered Saigon on this day and, like that. It's not that, timeline.
That's right. And some of, you just can't trust the human memory things that are that far back. I don't think there are any memories that I'm deliberately suppressing. I mean, for me, I don't know if we're at the point of this interview where a summary is important or not, because you can ask all the questions you want, and I've got time. For me, overall, it was a positive, illuminating experience. I got out of the eastern seaboard. I saw a significant part of the world. I've been back to Asia as a DoD historian. I've been back to Korea a couple of times, but I and I don't know if you hear this from guys or not. I view it as a positive experience. Here's you're heading out of here.
No, I'm going to do Max's Zoom call. Yeah.
Okay. I, I can't exactly say I enjoyed it because it got to be stupefyingly dull sometimes. Like being in that office all day, every day. It was just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And but I got to see and experience things in places that I would not otherwise have gotten to see and experience, and I did not feel that my life was in danger. I value that experience. I really do.
Well, I think in the pre-interview you said something very poignant about that I think it was your wife had said that you were more in danger working in the Pentagon in 2001 than you were in Vietnam.
That's true. But of course, I didn't know I was supposed to be in danger there. In Vietnam, I was supposed to be in danger. That's right. Because do you want me to talk about that briefly,
Sure.
or that because my office was in the flight path of that plane that hit the building, and because the building is configured with 5 concentric rings, and it's an upstairs downstairs configuration, the outside offices with the views are the most desirable, and of course the most vulnerable to attack from the outside, but that wasn't part of the equation. And the inside offices are where the domestic staff equivalent, ash and trash is what we called it in the military, were. I was in the innermost ring, right by the inner courtyard, which we used to call Ground Zero from the Cold War. You know, and so when that plane came in between quarters 3 and 4, it created death and destruction that got in through rings E, D, and C, or A, B, and C. I was in E, but right in the flight path. And when that plane hit, our office shuttered like a dumpster had been dropped on it. So that's yeah. It was. I don't know if you'd consider. I consider that a near enough thing. Let's say a near enough thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was an awful day. So I think Irene is right. Irene, that this was a day in which I felt peril. Sort of, I don't know if I could compare it to the night that guy broke into my room and tried to steal my money or not, but it in terms of within the framework of my 10 years in the Pentagon, this was the worst experience. Within the framework of my year in Vietnam, that was the worst experience. So, yeah.
Well, how did you feel? I know that you had moved on and you were probably involved in your PhD research at the time. But when you heard about the fall of Saigon in 1975, how did that make you feel about the war and your experience in it?
I never felt that I didn't do the right thing, personally. By the time Saigon fell, I don't know who it surprised, but it wasn't me. And so that it was pretty plain that it was a lost cause, and maybe even a stupid cause. But I signed on in '65. I went there in '66, and I never regretted doing what I did, and I never felt that what I did at that time was wrong. I didn't feel that. And it may have been because I was naive and stupid, but that's how I felt at the time. And then, you can't spend a whole lot of time looking back and saying, boy, given what happened in '73, 4, and 5, what I did in '66 and 7 was really dumb, because I did what I did in '66 and '67 before that happened. So I don't, 75, we were already here.
Okay.
My wife was head of reference at the University of Maryland Undergraduate Library, and I was writing my dissertation and taking care of a preschooler. He was just about getting ready for first grade. That was my job, essentially. I did not have full-time work. I was writing my dissertation. I was busy. I mean, Saigon fell. Obviously, I knew about it, but it just it did not cause a wave of introspection, and or a sense of loss or misspent time or anything like that. Saigon fell.
Did you go back to Vietnam when you went in Asia?
No, I never had the desire to go back. I know guys who did. I have a historian friend. He's now deceased, who studied small wars. Taught at Worcester College in Ohio, and he went he went as a tourist a couple times, and he loved it. And apparently, from what I heard from others, it's a very welcoming place. But I just had no interest in going back. You know, it's a valuable experience, but there was no connection for me.
Hmm.
You know.
Did you ever visit the Vietnam Memorial in DC?
Oh yes, oh yes. In March of 1968, I escorted a body home, and his name was on it. Yes, that was a searing experience for me. I was that was of course after I served there, and I was back here. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah.
You know, his name was Douglas Crow, and he was a captain and an advisor, and I was a captain in Post G4 at Fort Meade when the guy's body was delivered back to Dover Air Force Base, and I got assigned to take his body home because they do it on the basis of rank and religion.
Mm.
So I was a captain, and he was a captain, and I had put no religious preference on my forms, and he had put no religious preference on his forms. But he wasn't Jewish.
Huh.
So this was my first encounter with Christian burial
Practices.
and rituals. Okay?
Hmm.
And so I took the guy's body home to Madison, Wisconsin, which was not a place where the war was widely supported. Uh, the week of the high school basketball tournament, so there wasn't a hotel room in the town. So I spent my 3 or 4 days there in a cot in the funeral home
Oh
where
my goodness.
he was. Okay? And I participated in a private viewing, stood by the casket at a private viewing, and then the next day at a public viewing. And then I gave the flag to his mother at the cemetery. Jews put bodies in the ground the first day that isn't Saturday after a person dies. Done. It's over. This is different. You know, no argument about the virtues of one procedure over the other, but I was just not prepared to stand there in uniform next to that casket, which was only open from here up because he was in a hooch that was hit by a mortar round, so it was probably hamburger below here, and listen to his maiden aunts say how beautiful and how he looks like he's at rest.
Mm.
Still makes me crazy. And it almost made me really crazy then. It was a really searing experience. And I came back a wreck. And it didn't have, you know, I wasn't hospitalized or anything, but I was taking Russian at the time at night, just because it was free and offered by a University of Maryland professor on the Fort Meade campus. And I couldn't go back to school. I couldn't think anymore. My mind was just mush when I came back.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that was a searing experience related to Vietnam, but it was in Madison, Wisconsin. It was horrible.
Did the family try to like welcome you in any way?
They were very gracious, and they were very thoughtful, and they read a lot about Vietnam. And I don't remember their specific views, but they were not. They were just thoughtful, nice people. They took me out to dinner.
Yeah, I mean it's got to be hard when you're losing someone and then you've got this person here that's, you know,
Representing the institution in which they were killed. Right. That's
yeah.
right. That's right. So that was a memorable Vietnam-related experience. That was March of 1968. On the way home, I stopped in Chicago. I had a friend in law school there. Spent a couple days with Stanley. Probably got more drunk than I ever been in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It was really awful. that's not necessarily an intelligent or rational response to stress, but that's what stress is.
Well, I mean, when you talk about the beer being so cheap in Vietnam, I think you're kind of looking at the military offering like, well, this is what we got.
Yeah, yeah, well, yeah, well, yeah. So that was Vietnam for me, Madison, Wisconsin. And
Have you?
so,
Oh,
so
sorry.
I'm sorry. I did go back later when you asked about the memorial, and so I did go back later, and I found his name. His name was Douglas Crowe, and that's where I go when I take tourists there. Uh, I like the memorial is very contentious. The two parts of the memorial are very very asymmetrical or different. However, uh, I like the gash in the ground. I like the this is what it costs. I did not support the additional more heroic uh, addendum to the memorial. I didn't like that
Mm-hmm.
because glamorizing war doesn't get it. Doesn't get it. I mean, I didn't experience it, but I thinking rational human being, I just don't think it gets it. So yeah, I've been back to the memorial a number of times, and sometimes because we have visitors from other countries. We lived in Europe part time for 15 years. Uh, I tend to take them there, and I tend to tell them this story, and and I go back to see Douglas Crowe's name.
Yeah. I guess it's nice that he has a visitor on a regular basis that, he wouldn't have ever expected to
Yeah,
at him.
yeah. He was an advisor. He was out there, So he was from the part of the war that we are more accustomed to uh, talking about, I guess. The part where people were at risk on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you ever joined any veterans organizations or, worked with the VA or anything in terms of like long-term healthcare issues of Vietnam veterans?
No, no. I did get involved in protests against the war uh, in graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
And,
So is that just marching or was that more?
mainly marching. Um, we had an episode at the University of Wyoming that was not related to the war, but was strictly racial, which absorbed a lot of my focus because there were 14 black football players who wanted to protest the racist policies of the Mormon Church, which did not admit blacks to the priesthood at the time. And a priest is like a minister or a rabbi. And they wanted to protest against that. And their coach told them to go on Negro relief and threw them off the football team. So this is where I think the University of Wyoming discovered that this conservative black graduate student from Washington was a crazed radical Jew, because I was one of the seven. It's a whole campus of 18,000, or a town of 18,000. Campus is about 8,000. There were 7 history graduate students, or 6, and a law student. We said, no, this isn't right. This isn't going to happen. And we started to carry signs at some personal risk, because this is Wyoming.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the 7 became 20, became 75, became a couple hundred, and NPR and ABC came out, and lawyers got interested, and it ultimately played out the way it should play out, not on the street with signs. But we were the ones who started the Black 14 protest. And I'm proud of that. And my wife, who was then a librarian at the University of Wyoming and visibly pregnant, did her part by quietly going to meetings and protests and demonstrations, audio taping things, collecting broadsides, statements, position papers, and there's now the Irene Schubert collection at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming. She's the only one who collected the documentation of this tumultuous period. So, so that was her, and so her contribution to understanding this thing is far greater than mine. But we had a time in Wyoming.
That's wonderful. She did that.
Yeah, it is, and she had that mentality. Well, you're an archivist.
Yes.
You know, yeah, and of course, without archivists, historians don't function either.
We all work together to make a big picture.
So, I don't know if that's pretty much it.
Okay, do you have what do you think is the biggest misconception about the Vietnam War?
I never thought of that. I never thought of that. That's a really interesting question. What would be the biggest misconception? You mean in terms of what people think when they think about Vietnam today?
Yeah.
Boy, I don't know.
It's okay not to know.
No, I know it's not the only thing in the world that I don't know. Trust me, trust me on that. But I don't know, because I the biggest misconception. Geez. I don't know. I don't think the enterprise was well thought out. I don't think it was well conceived, but I think it was well intended at first. But I don't know. I don't know. I think the most unfortunate thing about its heritage is that we haven't learned a damn thing about it from it. And we're still doing the same stuff. I think it's underappreciated in that regard. If you're looking for, what are the major consequences, I would go in that direction, but I don't know about these conceptions. Because we're still in a mode where we're willing to have it to do things. I don't think it illuminates Ukraine at all. Let me say that.
Mm-hmm.
But Afghanistan, and in a way, in both cases, we created expectations for social mobility. We created expectations for civil existence, and then we let them go. Women in Afghanistan is the most shameful example.
Mm-hmm.
Shameful example. Mm-hmm. You ask good questions, lady.
Is there anything that you wish I had asked you about your experience in Vietnam that I didn't?
No, I was wondering whether no. The short answer is no. I was wondering whether or if you were going to get around to the daily routine, and I think we did cover that. I think we talked about how I kept track of the supply system, and of course trading, and about I thought the unreasonable work schedule because of the situation we were in. No, I don't think so. I think you asked good questions. Actually, I would be interested in. I don't know if it's not that important because I don't have grandchildren. I have a son, but I don't have grandchildren. So I'm not even sure that I really need to ask you or trouble you for a transcript or a copy of this interview.
Oh no, of course we're going to give you a transcript, and I'll send it to you, and then we'll let you review it. You have to review it before we put it into the collection.
So I have to go through this again?
No, but I mean, if you want to make any kind of edits or clarifications, then we let you do that and make sure that you're just cool with it.
I understand that. I mean, you know how to do oral history. That's clear to me.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, I mean, like you said, it's not like hardcore facts, but I think it's just an amazing medium to capture history and how it happened to people.
No, actually, I agree, and it gives a human dimension to the data, uh, and and history is about people. History is about people. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I've done a lot of these things. When I wrote my book on the Israeli air bases, construction of the Israeli air bases, as part of the Camp David deal. I did 70 or so interviews, and the way I use the interviews, and you're probably doing something that's similar, if not identical, is I let the participants, both Israeli and American, tell me what they think is important, and then I would take those overall insights and go examine the subjects that they told me was important. Because the project, as a government project will do, $1 billion project, that was real money 40 years ago, generated 1,000 boxes, 1,000 archives boxes. I could still be doing this project if I didn't use the oral histories as a guide to what's important. Not on how these important things played out, but in terms of what's important. And that's how I use oral interviews. So yeah, I think they're essential, very helpful.
Yeah, it's going to be a resource that people can use for a long time.
I hope so, and you're good at it.
Well, thank you, I appreciate it.
You are good at it.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.